The Grapes of Wrath is an essential novel written about and during one of America's most trying times, probably in history. The book begins with the introduction of Tom Joad, which is the main character, after his release from a 4-year prison term for manslaughter. He begins his trek back home to the family farm in Oklahoma. On his way home, he connects with an ex-preacher from his hometown, Jim Casey. Jim has lost his ability to preach due to a kind of crisis of faith. And now he believes that all life, including generally accepted sins, is holy in a sense. It's a more spiritual way of living. And when they make it back to Tom's family farm, they discover the farm to be abandoned, along with much of the small town surrounding it. And Tom eventually connects with his family at his uncle's cabin, where he discovers them preparing for a trek to California in hopes of a better life away from the dust storms that were occurring in Oklahoma. The trip to California was not an easy one, and many of the other families from his town and Oklahoma in general and the Great Plains region had decided to take that same journey to California. And as they came closer to their destination, they start to hear about the realities of California. They discover that California has become overcrowded with similar families searching for a better life, leaving a shortage of jobs and food for the migrants who were coming to California. Californians also did not welcome the newcomers warmly, rather putting those desperate families in sort of camps separate from regular society. At a camp named Hooverville, which was named after the president at the time, Tom and the preacher Jim got caught in a heated argument with local police. Jim ends up being arrested for violence against one of the police officers, and the police make it known in that camp that they were at that they intend to burn the camp down. But as the novel moves on, life actually becomes better for the family, the Jodes family, and at a separate government-run camp, they're living a better life, but there's still a shortage of jobs, which forces the family to move on from that camp because they can't survive without working and without a living wage. Tom actually reconnects with Jim and discovers that Jim has made many enemies with locals due to his desire to organize protests with the migrants who came to California. And in kind of the climax of the novel, in an altercation, Jim is killed by a police officer. Tom retaliates by killing that police officer, making him an outlaw of sorts who needs to hide from authorities. Tom decides to continue the work that Jim had been doing by organizing the migrant workers against the locals who had been treating them wrongly, and the government overall who had been forcing them into these camps and not giving them opportunities for jobs. Later in the novel, Tom's sister experiences a stillbirth, and as a symbol of the migrant struggle in California, the family sends the stillborn down a river in a casket. The Jodes then stumble upon a boy in a barn tending to his father, who is dying of starvation. Tom's sister, who had just birthed the stillborn, takes it upon herself to nurse the dying man and attempts to give him nutrition and save his life. And that's kind of where the story ends. The there's a little bit more imagery about religion and stuff, but that's how the main storyline ends. This book was written by John Steinbeck at the back end of one of America's most trying decades, the 1930s. Published in 1939, The Grapes of Wrath depicted the events of the severe drought of the early 1930s that most harshly affected Oklahoma and Texas. This drought was happening in conjunction with the Great Depression, and the drought caused a monumental agricultural disintegration in the area that relied on agriculture for the families to survive. So after World War I, the areas around Oklahoma and the surrounding states, known as the Great Plains, had become drastically overcultivated due to many reasons, including advances in technology and just greedy owners in general who wanted to be getting the most out of the land as they could. But there was a huge region of land that was then left with loose and exposed topsoil due to this over cultivation. So as the drought worsened, and with a severe absence of rain, the crops died rapidly in the region, ruining the farm industry in the Great Plains. Strong winds then enveloped this area, which picked up the loose topsoil and took it thousands of miles away. And this event of the topsoil being attacked by wind caused intense and dangerous dust storms. And the area affected by these dust storms became known as the Dust Bowl. So this was obviously a horrible natural disaster in the 1930s. And in the context of the book, the Jodes were right in the thick of the Dust Bowl, and that is why they attempted to migrate to California. So millions of Americans migrated to a supposedly better life in California, but discovered only more trouble. Due to overpopulation and the severe effects of the Great Depression, many families were jobless and starving. A huge amount of the people who migrated to California would not survive due to the shortage of food sweeping across America, which was due to the Great Depression. Many Americans on the East Coast and other areas of America were not fully conscious of the horrors of the Midwest until The Grapes of Wrath was published. So this book was integral to part of understanding the devastating effects of the Great Depression, the farming industry collapse in the Midwest, and natural disasters of the 1930s in general. So while the Jode family is fictional, Steinbeck took the responsibility of portraying realism in this fictional story. He even spent time in Oklahoma and made the trip to California himself to experience the troubles and struggles firsthand. And it's one thing to read about the Great Depression and the social structures and struggles of the 1930s in a history book, but it's an entirely more heart-wrenching reading a book like The Grapes of Wrath, where you feel the weight of America's failures within the decade, because you see how it affects people firsthand. So Grapes of Wrath is still an integral integral book today, because the story has maintained a sense of firsthand realism that many other books failed to do over time. And even with all that being said, I also decided not to touch on many of the other aspects of the book, because this book is so deep and meaningful. I neglected to mention all the commentary that Steinbeck has on spirituality, organized religion, and humanity itself. There's just not enough time in this space to break it down in its entirety. So while this novel is a fantastic depiction of the events of the 1930s, I think the real reason this book is included in this class and other class like it is because of Steinbeck's courage to protest the big guys like the banks of America, the greedy owners of land, and the government itself, for the failures of the 1930s, causing the Great Depression and all the suffering that it caused Americans. Steinbeck was not coy with his criticism either. He never hesitated to criticize in fear of retaliation. Many authors will censor themselves in a way to not receive ridicule in the masses, but Steinbeck was courageous, and he decided to not hold back at all, in a sense. And Steinbeck was not the first to do it, but he helped popularize the type of protest literature where writers use their pieces to create awareness and hopefully social change for the good. So this book, The Grapes of Wrath, was a great early example of sort of protest or rebellion literature. For example, The Grapes of Wrath sparked numerous societal movements and protests in the years following its release. And it's hard to really gauge what exactly it did, and we can't really know for sure. But I think the second phase of the New Deal created by Roosevelt, which was instituted in 1938 near the time of the release of The Grapes of Wrath, was affected by the book. Some would say that this book was a large part as to why the second phase of the New Deal remained a large factor of society after World War II and even today. There's still aspects of the New Deal instituted by Roosevelt that we still use today. And it was people like Steinbeck that sought to ensure that the government remained at the service of society, providing assistance to the needy at all times. And it was important for Steinbeck and others to raise awareness in America that there are people struggling and aren't getting help by the government. So with Steinbeck and other prominent figures in open protest of parts of the government and even the idea of capitalism in America itself, the following decades saw American presidents gain a greater focus on taking care of the common man and recognizing the failures of the system in the past that resulted in the Great Depression. So this book obviously had a huge societal impact and historical impact on America. So with everything being said, that leads me to my two questions for you guys. First, this novel is relevant today in America for a multitude of different reasons. For instance, the natural disaster causing the Dust Bowl, which led to millions of Americans migrating to safer places, is reminiscent to the natural disasters occurring today. One specific example would be the wildfires in California, which have been exacerbated by high temperatures and a dry climate. And those fires have devastated the land in California and the surrounding area, causing huge amounts of people to move away from their homes, which is similar to the story, as I was saying, in The Grapes of Wrath. So besides that example that I gave, what's another reason you guys find this novel to be relevant to today and current events of America? And your answers could touch on the environment like I did, or the style of writing that Steinbeck used, or even the economy. So let me know what you guys think about that. And for my second question, the effects of the Dust Bowl were enraged by the Great Depression occurring at the same exact time. So while the Dust Bowl was mostly about a natural disaster, it was also about the Great Depression overall. So these two events together caused major suffering and many deaths in this country. So my second question is if you believe America could have prevented such dramatic effects of the Dust Bowl if they had a better, more stable economic system and government in place during the 1930s. So I'd like you guys to explain why less damage could have occurred in America if there was a more stable environment and government, or whether it was inevitable for the Dust Bowl to cause that much suffering due to the volatile nature of the environment and the government in nature overall. There's always a change in government and environment. But do you think that could have been limited in a sense? Thanks.